So let's talk about the NRA. I will say, this is a conversation I was having with my father. It does seem, as if the NRA is kind of acting quietly, especially after Sandy Hook. I feel like that was necessary, but not grandstanding. Some say commendable, others say, you're on the defense.
Well, after Sandy Hook, we don't feel it's appropriate to exploit those kinds of things. So we wait until things calm down a little bit and then get into it. But the idea of jumping on this, the way the Brady group and the president, for that matter, within 24 hours, they're out there with Mayor Bloomberg saying we're going to use these kids to achieve our ideological goals. We just don't think it's appropriate. So we wait. And, there's always, the NRA has emerged since the 60s as the premier defender of the Second Amendment. That's the core part of our mission. And we have to work with a lot of people to do that. We do not believe in going out and setting ourselves on fire. We believe in trying to achieve actual policy goals. And so in the current controversy, for example, we have to deal both with the public and the media and the Congress. And at the end of the day, it's the Congress that's going to decide how this is going to go. So in order to win these battles, we need Republicans and Democrats, and we get them ordinarily. And I think we'll get them this time. But these people are under horrendous pressure, and will be under real pressure, particularly the Democrats, from this administration, because they're going to put everything they've got behind it. You've probably seen the news about the new senator from North Dakota. She's only been in office for a month and a half, and the Obama political operation is running negative attack ads on her because she said she thought the president's position on firearms was extreme. Well, that's going to happen to all these people. And so we're there to try and work with them and try and make sure that the debate gets around to substantive matters. And as in the past, if that happens, we're confident that it'll turn out right.
You mentioned, things being debated in Congress. Well, one would think, except for all these executive orders handed down. I mean, what's the NRA deem the limits to executive orders?
Well, the president can issue executive orders and does. He was wise enough not to take on something like the so-called assault weapons ban, because that would be so clearly over the line that even this Congress would revolt. But the fact of the matter is that as you look through the executive orders, some of them are sort of meaningless, some of them are peripherally important, some of them are very important. But in each case, in order to accomplish what he wants to accomplish by executive order, he's going to have to get money to implement that. And that means that ultimately these things are going to be the subject of congressional votes, because he can't conjure money up out of the air, even though he seems to do that to deal with the budget deficit, but he can't do it. He can't just appropriate money on his own. He has to go back to Congress. So we think some of these things are going to end up in congressional hands anyway. I think one of the reasons he did it that way, he has disdain for Congress on the one hand, but he also has a party to deal with. And I think he was hoping that he can get some of these things through without a congressional vote, so that members of his party, or members of his party likely to go with him or in a dangerous political situation, wouldn't face a vote. That's not going to happen. Everybody in that Congress is going to have to vote on the Second Amendment. The president said that he wanted the people to speak, and so do we. And I know that many members of Congress in both parties know that if they do the wrong thing, the people will speak.
People seem to be speaking with their dollars, their feet, and their hands, and they're buying, this gun buying trend. Do you see the membership and support of the NRA kind of the same pacing?
Well, it's interesting, because the last time that we had a big gun rights battle was in the 90s when Bill Clinton was president. And I went onto the NRA board in 2000. The membership, the natural membership, and these memberships fluctuate all the time, but the natural membership of the NRA at that time was about 1.8 million. Today, it's over 4 million. And it's fluctuating now. It's going up because we have determined through our own targeting and surveying and our political work that we roughly formally represent about 10% of the people who actually vote when the Second Amendment is threatened. And that's strangely in line with the Gallup poll findings that 30 million people consider themselves members of the NRA, even though only 4 million of them are deigned to pay us dues. So what happens when there's a crisis like this is that more and more of that 30 or 40 million join up because they want to make sure we're all unified, and that's what's happening now. And I find it remarkable that the president and the vice president suggests that what we're doing is fear-mongering so that people will join the NRA. And I've said time and again, the people that are doing the the people that are making people afraid that they're gonna lose their gun rights are not us. It's Dianne Feinstein, it's Andrew Cuomo, Charlie Schumer, and Barack Obama, and Joe Biden. They're the ones that are scaring the bejesus out of gun owners all over the country.
Opposite effect of what they say that
Right.
they're looking for. So let's talk about the Occupy tactics, because, you know, they go to the streets and they protest, but how do legal, law-abiding, you know, gun owners do that without looking like a bunch of gun nuts?
Well, you don't want to do that, but you know, during the course of the last week, I was at a rally on Sunday in Dover, Delaware. There were 1,600 people there. The press, which is not friendly to gun owners, had suggested that they'd have a good turnout if they got 50 people. The fire marshal said it was 1,600 and they were going to close down the hall. And that's happening all over the country. It's happening because people are concerned. What we're doing now is contacting our own members, contacting gun-favorable voters that are not our members, going to gun shows, going to these rallies, doing all these things. And one of the things we're telling people at gun shows is, you know, buying a gun is not a political act. Getting in touch with your senator or your congressman and telling him what'll happen if he does the wrong thing, that's a political act. And so our job is to convert all this interest into meaningful pressure on policymakers. You know, we look at the gun sales and we say, well, you remember some of these gun shops have got a picture of the president saying, oh, gun salesman of the year, because he is scaring people into buying guns, but that's not the only reason. I said that in the 90s, our membership was less than half of what it is now. In the 90s, one of the fastest way to go bankrupt was to start a private shooting range. Today, they're popping up all over the country. They're incredibly popular. They're very profitable for the people that do it. In the 70s and 80s, high school shooting teams and college shooting teams were being closed down all over the country. Today, they're being started up. And the difference is that the shooting sports and gun ownership for self-defense, for competition, for hunting has gone up remarkably in the last few years. The government does a survey of hunting every 5 years, and this is the first time in decades that the number of people who take to the field to hunt has gone up. It went up by 9%. As I say, we've got competition in shooting, all of our competitive things, and the NRA runs a lot of these, probably most of them. The participation has been shooting up in recent years. I talked to some gun show organizers 6 or 8 months ago on the East Coast that organize a lot of these gun shows, and they keep track of these things because it's how they make their living. And they said that 5 years ago, 8% of the people that attended gun shows were women. This year it was 38%. That sort of tells you what's happened. There's been an explosion in interest in firearms, an explosion in people being involved in the shooting sports. So it isn't just Barack Obama. That's the negative side. He's scaring people. It is also the fact that people are getting more and more involved and realizing that firearms have a place in their lives and a place where they can provide protection for them and their family on the one hand, and they're a lot of fun. A lot of people spend a lot of time at the range, and a lot more people hunt than ever before.
Yeah, that was one of my questions, whether, you know, is hunting still, and this was posed to me, you know, is hunting really still a valid argument, Kelly? Who needs a, you know, quote,
Well, they didn't
quote,
write the Second Amendment to protect hunting. There are
Right.
no squirrels mentioned in the Constitution. There may have been some at the convention, but they didn't actually make it into the Bill of Rights. You know, it was interesting because the Rasmussen poll last week asked people what was the principal reason for the drafting of the Second Amendment, and 65% of respondents said it was to protect us from tyranny. That's what it was put in the Constitution for, that and self-protection of the nation, the family, and yourselves. And all of these other things are things that we can enjoy because we have the right to keep and bear arms. In Europe, you couldn't do that. You know, one of the reasons the NRA was formed, we were formed in 1871 in New York, and one of our first presidents was Ulysses S. Grant. And the reason we were formed was because a group of Union generals realized that during the Civil War, their guys couldn't hit anything. And the reason they couldn't hit anything was that the South was recruiting people who were here for several generations, lived in rural areas and the like, and had grown up with firearms. In the North, the Union Army was recruiting people who were first generation people in the Industrial Revolution in the big cities. They were from Europe. There was no gun tradition in Europe. In most of the European countries, they weren't allowed to hunt. Remember, the ducks and the geese were the property of the king and royalty. So they didn't know anything about firearms. They got over here, were drafted or recruited into the Union Army, handed a gun, and proceeded not to be able to give a very good account of themselves in battle after battle. So the NRA was formed to provide civilian training in marksmanship and competence with a firearm and in firearm safety. That was our original mission. We picked the Olympic teams, we trained them, we trained police officers, we trained the rest. Even today, we provide training for police in the military. We run the competitions for police and military competitions. We run the national matches at Camp Perry in Ohio, which we've been doing for well over 100 years. So that was what it was. And when I go around and talk, I say, you know, from 1871 to 1970, really, we never endorsed a candidate. We didn't spend money on politics. We didn't have a lobbyist. We didn't have a lobbying arm, because everybody agreed that the Second Amendment meant exactly what it said. Life members of the NRA included everybody from both Roosevelts to Hubert Humphrey and John Kennedy and Dwight Eisenhower and the like. And then something happened in the late 60s, and it was this sort of cultural war that began to break out.
Sound familiar?
Yeah, and all of a sudden, guns became one of the things that were symbolic to the left of a country that they didn't like anymore. And they thought, they envisioned a country that didn't have firearms, because the Second Amendment doesn't just stand for your right to hunt, or even your right to defend yourself. It's really symbolic of an earlier America in which people took responsibility for themselves.
Well, let me ask you about that, because we have kind of I got a smart alecky email from a listener who said, well, who do we shoot first if we think tyranny is a threat?
Well, we're not in that position. We've got a lot to do. But let me tell you something. You know, about 8 years ago in Moscow, there was a banquet held in honor of General Kalashnikov, on the occasion of his 85th birthday. And General Kalashnikov, as many of your listeners will remember or know, was the inventor of the AK-47, which he actually invented in his spare time in World War II. He was a tank driver. And he's one of the few heroes that Russia has today that's not tainted by all of what went on during the communist period. So they had this banquet. President Putin made the toast. And when he was finished, the little general got up, stared him in the eye, lifted his champagne glass and said, Mr. President, I dream of a country like the United States, governed by men and women not afraid of an armed citizenry. And I tell people, you know, think about that for a minute. We've lived in that country since our founding. And other countries, no matter how powerful they may have been, no matter what they do, can only dream about it, can only dream of being in a country that's free. And it's remarkable to me that while they do this, all of the countries, for example, that broke from the Soviet Empire, one of the first things they did was legalize private firearms ownership, because they knew what happened when the Soviets and the Nazis came in. First they got the guns, then they got the country. So it's remarkable to me that other people dream of the rights that we have. And we have people that would say, well, you know, that was an old right. Remember, Justice Ginsburg went to Europe and said, don't pattern a constitution after ours. It includes a lot of archaic things like gun rights. That's not archaic. That's something that's as important today as it ever was. And it's perhaps in many ways more important, certainly, for defense of the family and the individual, because we have a problem across the country that where more and more Americans are realizing that the old saying about, you know, when you have seconds, the police are just minutes away.
Yeah. What do you think about the, you know, the idea that it isn't really the war on guns, that it could be really the war on ammo, bullets?
Well, this has been tried, you know, between 1966 and 1986. People had to keep records of ammo sold and all this sort of thing. And finally, the Justice Department said enough already. This doesn't do any good. Ammo is a commodity. You can't really control it. You can't. It doesn't have serial numbers. You know, and all it's doing is wasting money and keeping records, and things are piling up. And so it was the government that said, get rid of this. That was good advice then. It's good advice now, because this is not the same kind. I'll tell you, this is a funny story, because in Britain, where they try to outlaw and control everything, and in countries that have been influenced by the British way of looking at firearms, it is illegal to reload ammunition, partly because they tax it. And so if you reload your own, you're a tax evader. So back in the 1880s, we had a contest with the British called for what was called the Creedmoor Cup, and it hasn't been held in about 80 or 90 years. The Irish claim the British stole the cup, which is one of the things they claim about the British. So 2 years ago, we decided to re-challenge the Irish to engage in a new competition for the Creedmoor Cup, and they ran into a problem. Because in competitive shooting, you really can't use off-the-shelf ammunition because it's not accurate enough. It does for competitive shooting. But the Irish Parliament was so anxious to defeat the United States that they legalized reloading so that their team could actually compete. We won the match, but the captain of the Irish team said, "Oh, you just think you won. Actually, we won because we got one of our rights back."
Yeah.
So this whole idea, all of these things are designed for one purpose. And that purpose is not to tomorrow abolish firearms, because that's an impossible task and they know it. It's to make acquiring a firearm more expensive and more troublesome. It's to make ammunition more expensive and harder to get.
That's already happening.
That's right.
It's already happening.
Even on hunting, at one point during the beginning of the Obama administration, he proposed that no one should be allowed to have a firearm on any federally owned land unless they were 18. Now, I don't want to sound paranoid, but to get people into the shooting sports, to get kids in, you got to start a lot earlier than that. If you can stop them until they're 18, you've stopped them. And in the West, banning firearms for people under 18 on federal lands means no hunting, because 95% of the land in many of those states is in fact federal land. He had to withdraw that proposal because Congress was up in arms, in particular the Western senators and congressmen. But the fact is that from a political standpoint, if you do all of those things, and the number of people that hunt, the number of people that shoot, the number of people that go to the range and buy firearms diminishes, at some point the critical mass that gives them the political power they need to keep their rights begins to disappear. That's what's the problem in other countries, in the European countries, where hunting exists, but it's an elite activity, and it's engaged in by very few people whose position is to go to their government and beg for the right to do what they enjoy. And the government says, well, maybe we'll let you do that as long as it doesn't get out of hand. In this country, it's the only country in the world in which we have a politically active population that believes in the private ownership of firearms and the right to keep and bear arms. I should say the only one that at least has a Second Amendment to rely on and is politically able to do it. On the eve of our annual meeting last year in Russia, on Channel 1, which would be their equivalent of, say, the BBC or CBS back in the day, they had a sort of Dancing with the Stars type debate, and that you called in. And the question was, should Russians have the individual right to keep and bear arms? And a million people called in, and the vote was 76 to 24, that they should have. So even in a country that doesn't have that, and doesn't have the right, most Russians agree with General Kalashnikov. And I suspect most of them, like most Americans, would say that's important, not just so we can shoot squirrels, but because that's the balance that keeps a society free.
I want to talk about, I need you to give me a definition to work with, because even as of, yesterday on Sunday, I was on, a panel trying to debunk the argument that the government restricting our rights is a good thing by using scare words like assault weapons.
Right.
So can you, where is the exact defining line between sporting rifle and assault?
Well, I was walking through our museum the other day. We have the National Firearms Museum in Washington. And in our museum is a gun that was taken by Lewis and Clark in 1806 when they went up to the Missouri in search of the Columbia River. It's a semi-automatic firearm. It was designed for the Belgian military and has a detachable magazine and fires 20 shots. That gun would no doubt be illegal if Dianne Feinstein had her say. The semi-automatic rifle has been available in this country, not commercially that long ago, but for well over 100 years. Most shotguns that are sold today in this country are semi-automatic weapons. not most rifles, but many hunting rifles are semi-automatics. And the problem that the gun banners have always had is that there is no difference functionally between any of those firearms and what they call an assault weapon. They're exactly the same. The president and others like to say these military weapons designed for the battlefield. They're not.
Scare words.
Those are scare words because the military weapons are fully automatic. And I've said time and again that if we equipped our Army with the AR-15 and sent them to war, they could be beaten by any country on the globe because all the other countries have much better firearms for use in battle theaters. The AR-15 is a semi-automatic weapon. It looks like the M16 from which it's descended, but it is a semi-automatic version functionally. And the reason it's so popular, there are a lot of reasons why it's popular. One is that it is an incredibly versatile platform for shooting. Most people today who are trained in rifle shooting are trained on the AR-15. It's used for varmint hunting and the like. It's used for competitive shooting. There was a survey of AR-15 owners. 51% of them belong to a shooting club and shoot them all the time at the range. It's used in the national matches, the competitive matches at Camp Perry and elsewhere. It's not a cheap firearm. It's pretty expensive, even before the rush on them because of the Obama threat to ban them. It was a $1,000 or more gun. It's not used very often in crimes because criminals don't buy $1,000 semi-automatic firearms at a dealer to go out and commit crimes. In fact, and this is where you get into all of this, in fact, in 2009, which is the last year that we have Justice Department numbers for, in this country, 4 times as many people were stabbed to death than were killed by all long arms. That's shotguns, rifles, quote, assault weapons, and the like. More people were beaten to death than were killed with all long arms. So we're really talking, the number of that die as a result is like 200, 230 or something of that nature. So what you really got is politicians who are building a caricature of something that doesn't in fact exist. And the problem they've had in the past, and this is what took place in '94, when they decided to ban assault weapons, they couldn't ban them on function because that would have meant banning your shotgun that you took duck hunting, or the rifles that had been in the family for 50 or 100 years. So what they had to do was ban them based on cosmetics. So they essentially said that here is a list, and they had to list them because they all look different. Here is a list of ugly guns, and it has these various features, and if they have those features, those cosmetic features, then we're going to ban it. And when we say, well, it was eventually allowed to expire because it didn't make any impact whatever, they said, well, that's because people changed the cosmetics and they weren't banned anymore. Well, if the reason for banning them was because of cosmetics, for example, because they look like the military weapon, they had a bayonet lug on them. Now, nobody uses that. And so the manufacturer said, well, if that's one of the things that they don't like, we'll take it off. Yeah. So now what they've said is, well, if it's got a pistol grip, then it must be an assault weapon. And most of these manufacturers make the same firearm with and without the pistol grip. And our question is now, why is this one dangerous and that one not dangerous? And the answer is, there's no difference. There's no functional difference. And all this is an attempt to scare people into thinking these are something that they're not.
I saw something about 3D printable magazine that they're thinking of banning, the higher capacity magazine. They're 3D printable magazines.
Well, one of the things that's concerned them is that with these new copiers, you can copy anything.
Right.
You can make one.
There's
I mean, you can make one with old technology for about $4. It might not work as well as some others, but in the 90s when the so-called assault weapons were banned, so were the high capacity magazines. Now, when you talk to somebody and say, what about these high capacity magazines? Well, that sounds sensible. They don't really need that, do they? And the problem is that there's no empirical evidence that a high capacity magazine, say one that shoots 30 or 10 or whatever, makes any difference to a killer. You can change magazines in a second if you're any good. And that's not enough pause to do any good. A high capacity magazine has a much higher likelihood of jamming. But the point is, it doesn't make much difference. And then you get into these bidding matches. The president says, well, we shouldn't have 30-round magazines. I think we ought to have 10-round magazines. So the governor of New York says, well, I can do better than that. I think we should have 7-round magazines. And now what that did was, what the New York proposal does is he says, we're not going to outlaw handguns, but if you have a 7-round magazine requirement, that makes 95% of all handguns that are now sold inoperable. And under the New York law, it is nothing is grandfathered. If you have anything that is capable of holding more than 7 rounds, that's a crime in New York. So what he's done is, under the guise of dealing with the magazines, is he's outlawed the guns. The police, of course, are up in arms because it also applies to them. And so virtually every New York police officer right now is in violation of the state law.
It's like it being illegal to reload. I want to.
But what it is, I mean, here's the real crux of it. These people blame guns. They blame magazines. They blame all of these things. You notice the president doesn't talk about gun crime. He talks about gun violence. And there's very little talk about the people who misuse the firearm. There's very little talk about them. All the talk is about the gun itself. And that has been the problem that we've had in dealing with liberals on this issue from the 70s on, because it's their position that really criminals aren't responsible for their own acts. It's something else. If either they grew up poor, their mother mistreated them, somebody bullied them, there's some kind of a problem, and if they have a gun, it's the gun's problem. So I've likened it, if we treated drunk drivers this way, when we caught a drunk driver, we'd crush his car and say, well, if you didn't have that car, you wouldn't have been driving drunk. Now, that's definitionally true, and if you didn't have a gun, you wouldn't kill somebody with a gun. That's true. You'd knife them, beat them to death with your hands, or club them with a baseball bat. And what's happened in other countries where they say there's less gun violence, it hasn't affected the murder rates or the violent crime rates. What it just means you use a different tool, because the people who do this are not nice people.
I was just today, someone said, when it comes to this issue with guns and, post Sandy Hook, everybody agrees, something should be done.
Right.
That's one thing everybody can agree on. But I mean, what is that? I mean, you hear the word over and over, compromise, but what should that be?
Well, yeah, I mean, they've asked me if we would compromise. I said, I'll compromise on things to get something that works. There's no reason to compromise to give people something that restricts your rights and where there is no evidence whatever that it would have any impact. You do not give up rights that cavalierly. And in fact, while the Second Amendment, like the First Amendment, is not absolute, famously you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. There are things that you can restrict under the Second Amendment. One of the things you cannot restrict is a commonly owned weapon. That would be the AR-15. You can't restrict that. You can restrict a rocket launcher because nobody has it. You can restrict a machine gun because nobody has those. But you can't restrict a shotgun, a rifle, or a sidearm because those are firearms that are in common use in this country. And in addition to that, if you attempt to restrict or limit a fundamental constitutional right, what you propose has to really be justified. It's looked at by the courts very critically, and there has to be a solid reason for doing it that shows a public good. And on that kind of a argument, none of these things show any benefit. So you just can't willy-nilly go around banning things. You can't, just as you can't say, well, I don't want you to say these things because I don't like them. That's not sufficient reason to ban things. Or pornography would be the assault weapons in the English language, and we'd have to ban that too. Now, some people might think it's a good idea, but that's why we have constitutional rights, so you can't just go around saying you can only say what I want, or you can only do what I want and not what you want.
Anything else? I mean, we can talk for hours. Anything
Depends
else?
on how long your show is.
Yeah, I know. Well, the show's 3 hours, but I mean, I don't want to.
But I do want to say something about, because of in reference to that question, we went to the Biden meetings, and our reaction was not surprise, because we knew what it was. They wanted to be able to say, oh yeah, and we talked to those folks too. But our reaction to the whole thing and what's happened at the administration level since Sandy Hook is that they're asking the wrong question. Their question for all these meetings is what can we do about guns, not how can we protect the kids. That's a different question, and it results in different answers. So when we came out and said, maybe we should think about a broken mental health care system and security for the schools, everybody reacted. The president then looked at the polls, because parents in this country weren't asking what kind should we allow potential mass killers to have, ugly guns or good looking guns, or what size clips should they have. Parents were saying, how are my kids going to be safe? And they looked at the polls. So the president, really for fig leaf purposes in his speech, came up with, well, we agree on security, and I'm going to add 1,000 security officers. Today there are 135,000 schools. 30,000 of them have armed security, and the president's willing to add another 1,000. And I submit that that does not solve the problem, doesn't move in the direction of solving the problem. What it does on the security front is give him a fig leaf so he can say he's for it. On the mental health front, we have a broken mental health care system. 16% of all the people in our prisons today have been diagnosed as severely mentally ill. In every single state, not most states, not some states, in every single state in this country, there are more severely mentally ill people in prison than in the public and private mental health care facilities in that state, every single one. And the fact of the matter is they get worse in prison, and then they're released onto the streets. And then we can't imagine why we've got people out there that essentially have time bombs in their heads, and it goes off. They become the mass shooters. They become the woman who pushes somebody under a subway in New York, and the president said, we'll study that. Well, virtually every mass shooting since the 1960s has been by one of these people. The most famous early one was the one at the University of Texas, the fellow that climbed up in the clock tower after telling his psychiatrist he was going to climb up in the clock tower and shoot people. He then did it. And I looked back through our records, and from that point on, we had been saying something needed to be done to keep firearms out of the hands of people who were adjudicated to be potentially violent and dangerous. And in 1993, it was on Face the Nation, Wayne LaPierre was on with then Congressman Chuck Schumer. And Wayne said, you know, the NIC system, which is the instant check system, does not include these people. And we've been urging they be put into the system. If they've been adjudicated to be dangerous, they shouldn't be able to buy a firearm, regardless of what it looks like. And Chuck Schumer got up and said, I can help you with that, and shook hands with Wayne LaPierre, and that was 1993, and it hadn't been done yet.
You're talking about a do-nothing Congress and their president with no budget in 4 years. Oh, just feels like it's getting worse.